move along. So Diana, we're ready when you are.
Help if I could unmute. Hold on one sec. Let me get the right button.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, to the September 1st, 2020 afternoon meeting of the Lane County Board of Commissioners. I'm going to just talk about some housekeeping items because we do have a public hearing that we're going to go into next. And I know that there are speakers that are interested in giving testimony. So for the public that's watching the meeting, when you're registered to watch, you're registered in our system as attendees. Attendees are webinar participants who are simply viewers of the meeting, also known as an audience member. Your microphone and your webcam are automatically muted as attendees. However, there will be a time during the meeting we'll open it up for public testimony. When that time comes, if you wish to make public comment, I'll ask you to raise your virtual hand. And since we're going immediately into a public hearing, if that's what you want to testify on, I would say raise your hand now. You should have a hand icon on your device and you only need to press it once. When it's time for public comment, I will ask the moderator to facilitate. When your name is called, you'll be unmuted and given 3 minutes for public comment. When your 3 minutes is up, you'll go back into muted status and you can stay on for as long as you'd like. We'll try to give everyone who wishes to present comment an opportunity to speak. But please note, in the event that there are more people wishing to speak than time allots, we may need to limit the number of speakers or the time allotted to each speakers or speakers speak it randomly or chosen randomly. With that, I don't think we'll have that particular issue. We do have our timer ready at 3 minutes. So I'll start in on our first agenda item this afternoon. It is agenda item 11A on our sheet, if you're following. So this is a second reading and public hearing for ordinance number 20-08 in the matter of amending Lane Code 16.244, Floodplain Combining Zone Rural Comprehensive Plan, LC 10.271, Floodplain Combining District for lands within the urban growth boundaries, to modernize terminology and formatting, clarify review processes, and align the code more closely with state law and the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR Title 44, and adopt a savings and severability clause. File number 509-PA20-05047 and order 20-08-18-13 in the matter of amending Chapter 11 of the Lane Manual to remove Section 11.020 Flood Hazard Studies. And I'll go into the purpose of the hearing. So this is a public hearing. The date today is September 1st, 2020. The proposed Lane Code amendments are subject to the applicable criteria identified in Lane Code 12.005, 12.050, and 16.252 subsection 2 and are applicable statewide planning goals. The order of the proceedings for this hearing will first be the report by staff, followed by some public testimony, and then additional comments by staff. Failure to raise an issue with sufficient specificity to enable a response may preclude appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals on that issue. Prior to the conclusion of the public hearing, any participant may request that the record be left open and provide an opportunity to present additional written evidence or arguments regarding the application. However, the board is not obligated to leave the record open. The board's decision may be appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals in accordance with ORS Chapter 197. Now I'll call for any disclosure of a commissioner abstentions due to conflicts of interest or bias. Are there any abstentions or disclosures? Commissioner Sorensen.
I wasn't able to see in the staff materials whether or not Mr. Malone will be involved in this matter or not, and I'm wondering if staff could further educate me on that. If so, then I would have to make would want to make a disclosure.
Is any staff available for that question?
Yes, this is Rachel Sursliv. Mr. Malone has not participated in the on the floodplain code amendment project so far.
Okay, thank you so much.
This is Diana, real quick. I do show Mr. Malone is on the phone for public comment, however.
Well, out of an abundance of caution, I'd like to just say that Mr. Dingle and I have discussed whether or not it's appropriate for me to make a disclosure about a potential conflict of interest. Mr. Malone operates a law firm. I operate a law firm. Some years ago, we were doing work together, business together, but we have not been doing work together for many months. And I just wanted to put it on the record that I have had a business relationship with him. I have not discussed this matter or any other matter involving him testifying before the board. And so that's why I ask about that today. Thank you.
Any other disclosures from board members? Okay, I don't see any. So I'll go to the next item, which is call for any challenges to the board's qualifications to hear the matter. Any challenges? All right, I don't hear any or see any. So we'll start with our report by staff, and with us, as you know, is Rachel Sursliv.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just gonna ask for Diana to share my screen, and I have a presentation for you all.
Rachel, I'm trying to share the screen with you. It's not letting me do it. One moment.
No problem. Well, while Diana looks into that, I can get started. For the record, this is Rachel Sursliv, staff planner for the Floodplain Code Modernization Project, and this is Ordinance 20-08. And I am here before you today to provide a presentation on the code amendments that have been provided in the agenda cover memo. And today I'm going to go over some general floodplain concepts, including Lane Code's current standards and Lane County's floodplain permitting processes. And then I will go into specifically the Floodplain Code Modernization Project. And I will be focusing mainly on the Planning Commission's motion and recommendation for approval of the ordinance and the amended code. And to start off, Lane Code or Lane County's floodplain code provisions and regulations come primarily from being a participating community in the National Flood Insurance Program. And that's a program that provides discounted insurance to communities that adopt certain minimum floodplain standards. And the Code of Federal Regulations includes these provisions. Lane County is also a participating community in the Community Rating System, which is an additional insurance discount program that incentivizes communities to adopt higher regulatory standards. And so that's where most of the existing floodplain regulations come from. And many of the proposed code amendments that I'm going to discuss later are higher regulatory standards that could change Lane County's class in the community rating system for the better. So Lane County's floodplain standards are located in Lane Code Chapter 16.244 and Chapter 10.271. Those are the floodplain combining zones. And these code sections work in conjunction with FEMA's floodplain mapping. So FEMA has studied Lane County and identified areas of flood hazard risk throughout the county. You'll see the zones for various flood hazard risk identified as Zone A or Zone AE or the floodway. And those are all different zones associated with different levels of risk. And within those zones, when you're proposing a development, you'll be subject to specific design criteria and design standards. Most commonly is the elevation of structures. There's foundation requirements and enclosed area requirements, things like that. I did have an example of a flood insurance rate map, which depicts Lane County's different flood hazard areas. And you'll see on that example that most of the risk areas in Lane County are A zones and AE zones. And the difference between those zones, in the A zone, FEMA has not studied the flood hazard in that area, and they haven't studied it in a way to determine what the base flood elevation is or the level of the flood waters in those areas. And that's commonly referred to as a BFE. And then in the AE zones, those are more detailed studied areas. And so we do know what the flood levels are in that area based on that mapping study. And so we do have BFEs in those areas. And then we'll also see areas of floodway, which are higher velocity floodwaters flow through the floodway. It's the main channel of the river when there's a flood event occurring. And to touch a bit on Lane County's floodplain permitting, any development located in a flood hazard area is required to receive some type of permit. So may that be for structural development or for fill development. Fill is considered development and must receive a permit when fill is proposed to be placed in the flood hazard area. And then there are also certain type 2 permits that are required for more complex proposals, such as proposals to develop in the floodway, which, as I said earlier, is a more hazardous flood zone. So those are the, oh, it looks like thank you, Diana. I will just share my screen here. Okay. Hopefully you're all seeing that now. So that's our flood permitting. So I'm going to move into the proposed code amendments and the purpose of this project. So the purpose is to update Lane Code's floodplain hazard, or our floodplain codes that contain the regulations for development in flood hazard areas. And the main purpose is to align the code with the Code of Federal Regulations, which contain the minimum standards for participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. And this was a result of this project partially came about because of a community assistance visit that Lane County underwent with FEMA and DLCD, where they reviewed our floodplain regulations and our floodplain permitting process. And as a result of the community assistance visit, Lane County is required to update their floodplain code with approved floodplain ordinance language as compiled by DLCD, Department Land Conservation and Development. And they have produced a model flood hazard ordinance for communities in Oregon to follow. And so in order to ensure compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program, we are following this model flood hazard ordinance and adopting that language. At the same time, last year in June and December, the board provided staff with direction regarding these code updates. Staff presented policy change options to the board at their request, and the board directed staff to engage the public on these policy changes, which we did late last year. And after that public outreach, staff was directed to work on these code amendments. So we are back before you today with a revised code. And I will move into the policy considerations. Today, I'm going to go over the main policy changes that are higher regulatory standards in the proposed code and the details of the Lane County Planning Commission motion on this topic. The staff agenda cover memo contained a lot of information, so I'm just going to try to hit the main points and really talk about the Planning Commission's motion on this topic. So moving into the first higher regulatory standard, which is a critical facilities provision. And this is a provision that is recommended but not required by the DLCD model ordinance. It was also presented to the board as a higher regulatory standard. These types of facilities are defined as facilities which are important during a flood or relied on during a flood, and or are can be very detrimental if they are damaged during a flood event. And so the provision aims to locate facilities outside of flood hazard areas where possible, or if they must be placed within a flood hazard area, they'll be required to be elevated to a higher degree. The current code in effect right now does not contain any provisions specific to critical facilities. And during the Lane County Planning Commission public hearing, we did receive some comments regarding this provision, specifically from the Eugene Water and Electric Board regarding the establishment of utility facilities. And in relation to this provision, there was some concern that this provision could have a negative impact on the feasibility of establishing those types of facilities. And so the change that occurred during the Planning Commission was an exception for utility facilities was made in the definition of critical facilities. That was not specifically motioned on, but it was a change that was made during the public hearing process at the Planning Commission. The second higher regulatory standard that I will cover is the compensatory storage for fill, also known as balance cut and fill. This is a topic that was requested by the board when we first came before you last year. And this proposed regulation aims to mitigate the effective fill material placed in the special flood hazard area. The current floodplain code does not address the mitigation of fill, meaning that any amount of fill can be established in the floodplain so long as it's documented through a floodplain permit. However, this is concerning because the effects of fill when placed in the floodplain, it can cause the displacement or the displacement of floodwaters and the separation of floodplain areas. Fill in the floodplain could also cause a rise in floodwaters, move floodwaters from one property to another, and have impacts on riverine habitats. So staff considered and incorporated many design criteria into the proposed regulation, but most notably, staff felt that the regulation should be broken down into thresholds based on the amount of fill placed in order to determine the requirements for mitigating fill placed in the floodplain. We determine these thresholds by reviewing the permit history that we have on file for fill proposed in the floodplain. And initially, staff identified 7 cubic yards, 200 cubic yards, and 500 cubic yards of fill as being the threshold for compensating fill and thresholds for determining other requirements when placing those amounts of fill. During the public hearing at the Planning Commission, the commission requested that the amount of fill defined as de minimis be revised from 7 cubic yards to 50 cubic yards. So that amount that we define as minimal development or not needing to be compensated was revised from 7 to 50 during the public hearing at the Planning Commission. And the justification behind that change is to make that standard consistent with other permitting agencies, specifically with the Department of State Lands, who requires a permit for 50 cubic yards of fill when it's proposed in a wetland area. So that was the Planning Commission's justification for that change from 7 to 50 cubic yards. Also, per public comment received during the Planning Commission hearing, concerns were raised regarding mineral and aggregate operations and their ability to meet this provision. And an exception was added to the language that's before you today, which allows an exception for mineral and aggregate operations. And lastly, the Planning Commission ultimately motioned to remove this provision entirely from the proposed code. The Planning Commission felt that there was not sufficient justification or study of the issue to be proposing a mitigating measure at this time. So they motioned to have it removed and recommended that the board direct staff to study the topic further. During deliberations, the Planning Commission did also discuss alternative solutions to the issue, such as requiring a step-back water analysis or a no-rise certification for any placement of fill in the floodplain. And this is the same thing that's required for floodway development currently. Another possible option would be prohibiting fill altogether for the elevation of structures in the special flood hazard area, as elevating structures is the most common instance when large amount of fill is placed in the floodplain. Ultimately, staff did not remove the compensatory storage requirement from the proposed code before the board today. As I said earlier, this was a specific provision that was requested directly from the board, so it was kept in the proposed code that's before you today. Next, I'll move into the cumulative substantial improvement provision. Substantial improvement is defined as any repair or addition to a structure in the floodplain that the cost of exceeds 50% of the market value of the structure. If an improvement is classified as substantial, that structure, if it's non-conforming with the floodplain regulations in place, would have to be altered to comply with the current floodplain regulations. And in many instances, this can mean elevating the structure. The change that we're proposing here is to include a requirement to count substantial improvements cumulatively over a period of time. So instead of looking at a substantial improvement on a case-by-case basis, we propose to look at them over a longer period of time to capture the overall improvements being made to a non-conforming structure. Staff initially proposed a period of 10 years to count improvements. The rationale that being that over that time period, a homeowner is likely to make significant improvements to their home, and such an investment should be adequately protected from flood hazard. However, the Planning Commission motioned to revise the standard from 10 years to 5 years. The commissioners were mainly concerned with tracking with the tracking of the improvements being lost over time. And there was concern that new buyers of homes would not know when they would be required to improve the structure, since the average time that Americans live in the same house is on average less than 10 years. So in the proposed code that's before you today, the cumulative time frame has been revised from 10 to 5 years. Moving into the floodway prohibition. So the initial version of the code as presented to the Planning Commission contained language that prohibited all development in the floodway, except for lands for which an alternative location outside of the floodway was not available. And we wrote the code that way to so as not to take any development rights from a property. The currently effective floodplain code allows development in the floodplain or the floodway with a registered engineer's step back water analysis and a no-rise certification. And this is a minimum requirement of the National Flood Insurance Program. During the Planning Commission public hearing, public comment was submitted expressing concern for existing development in the floodway and the potential to expand that existing development. And the concern was mainly expressed regarding commercial developments. So during the Planning Commission public hearing, staff revised the language to only prohibit residential development in the floodway. Staff's initial intent with this provision is to protect life and property where there's severe flood hazard in existence, and that's in the floodway. And our stance was that a residential use was the highest risk use when established in the floodway. So during the Planning Commission hearing, provision was revised to only prohibit residential development specifically, while other types of development are allowed with the no-rise certification. The Planning Commission did not specifically reference this provision in their motion, although they did review the changes to the code that occurred. And the revisions that occurred during the public hearing process are contained within the code that's presented before the board today. On this same note, Chair Buck requested some evaluation of Yamhill County's floodway development standards due to some public comment that was received prior to this hearing, noting that several counties' counties floodway development standards prohibit residential development in the floodway. And this comparison was provided to the commissioners before today in order to look at a Yamhill's County code compared to the proposed code before you today. And additional public comment cites Marion County and Deschutes County as also having codes that prohibit residential development in the floodway. And so staff has reviewed those codes, finding that Marion County allows development in the floodway with a variance application and a floodplain development permit. And Deschutes County appears to allow development with a no-rise certification, which is the same as what Lane County's existing floodway regulation is currently. Moving on, the increased freeboard is a other higher regulatory standard that was included in the proposed code. Staff initially proposed an additional foot of freeboard in all flood zones. So freeboard is the elevation of a structure above the base flood elevation or above the flood levels. And in the AE zone, where we know what the flood levels are, the current code requirement is to elevate 1 foot above that BFE. And in A zones, it's 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade where we don't know the flood levels. And staff is proposing to increase those elevation requirements by 1 foot in each of those zones. The Planning Commission motioned on this topic to leave the elevation standards as is in the existing floodplain code. However, this policy option was something that the board had directed staff on previously. So in the proposed code that's before you today, the higher regulatory standard is retained, and the 2 feet and 3 feet is what's in the proposed code today. Although the Planning Commission did motion to leave the elevation requirements as is. And lastly, I will talk about a specific provision for floodway encroachment for fish enhancement projects. The purpose of this language is to allow habitat restoration and enhancement projects that increase the base flood elevation without the need for a conditional letter of map revision, commonly called a CLOMAR. A CLOMAR is something that's normally needed when a project will increase the base flood elevation or change the mapped floodplain in some way, and can be quite costly. So per a FEMA policy, these types of projects were to be allowed to increase the BFE and would not be required to receive a CLOMAR for the purpose of restoring natural floodplain areas. However, this policy was recently rescinded by FEMA. Staff got notice of this on August 24th. So the proposed code contains language that must be updated to reflect the recent change. And the implications of the rescinded policy is that a CLOMAR will be required for the restoration projects, and staff is still recommending inclusion of this new language because it restricts other types of development from the floodway that may increase flood elevations, and it restricts it to only allow restoration or enhancement projects. So that's something that will have to be changed in the proposed code, and I will touch on that a bit more later. Moving into some other changes in the code, the first is a motion topic from the Planning Commission regarding the number of elevation certificates required, and elevation certificates are something that are required for the verification of how high a structure is built in a floodplain, and the Planning Commission motioned to keep the changes regarding the number of elevation certificates required. The model code required 3, and we would like to keep that as 2, and the Planning Commission motioned to do that. And the other topic I want to touch on is this language regarding before the regulatory floodway. Staff pursued the removal of a specific provision that requires a professional analysis of the impacts of development when development is proposed in a flood hazard area that has base flood elevations but does not have a mapped floodway. The rationale behind the removal of this provision was that it would be very costly for property owners to do new development in these areas because they'd have to go through a costly professional analysis. However, staff confirmed with FEMA that we could not take this language out because not including the provision would cause non-compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program. So therefore, the provision was added back into the proposed code that's before the board today. And lastly, specific criteria for obtaining a variance to wet flood-proof a structure was added to the proposed code between the public hearing at the Planning Commission and the public hearing today. And the provision that was added codifies a recent FEMA policy regarding variances to wet flood proof. So that's something that was added recently. And lastly, I'd like to go over some public comment received specifically regarding the road standards. Prior to the public hearing today, there was comment submitted by several parties who generally raise issues that the proposed code does not set forth more restrictive standards, and this comment was disseminated to the board. I'd like to discuss specifically road and access development standards, as there were comments submitted that support the removal of the provision and also comments that wanted the standards to be retained. The current code has standards that generally require the elevation of any access in the floodplain. Staff is proposing the removal of this standard because implementation of this standard could have significant negative effects on the function of a floodplain area. Elevation of roads would be achieved mainly by placing large amounts of fill in the floodplain, which could result in fragmenting the floodplain and disrupting flows of water, possibly pushing floodwaters into areas that didn't flood before or raising flood levels. I will also note that all of the higher regulatory standards that are presented today are methods identified by FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program to better protect floodplain development and lives. However, FEMA nor the National Flood Insurance Program provide any guidance or proposed code language relating to road development. And for those reasons, staff recommends that we remove those road standards from the code. And in the version of the code that's before you today, those road standards have been removed. And because staff needs to make the revisions to the code regarding FEMA's new policy for fish enhancement projects, staff is requesting continuance of the hearing to a date and time certain in order for staff to make those changes. And I have identified October 6th as a date for a third reading. That concludes my staff report, and I am available for any questions. Thank you.
Very good. So we will move on to public testimony. And unless there's more staff, I see Kier, is there more to chat about before we move to public testimony? You're on mute.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I know that was long, and I just want to say I appreciate Rachel trying to break that down for you. I know this isn't a language that many of you speak. It's pretty technical and complex. I do want to just say that we recognize that this is an important project. It's a controversial project. We anticipate that you're going to hear public testimony about these standards today, maybe pushing one way or the other. Just want to reiterate that staff is very open-minded to direction we receive from the Planning Commission and the public, and obviously direction provided by the board. We do present these options before you today as policy choices. Typically, we evaluate recommendations of the Planning Commission, and generally, often those are forwarded on to the Board of Commissioners without edits. In this instance, because we did have previous input from the board and staff has a lot of past experience in administering and developing these kind of floodplain regulations, not all of those recommendations were carried forward, but some of them were. The one thing I'll just queue up for discussion, I anticipate that you'll hear a lot of discussion regarding the floodway development standards, and that is something that we welcome the board's feedback on and look forward to altering that if necessary. Apologies, my dog's in the background. So that that'll do it for my presentation. Thanks.
Very good, thank you. Okay, now we will move forward to public testimony regarding these floodplain combining zone amendments, and then we'll do additional comments by staff, followed by closing the hearing unless we decide otherwise, and discussion by the board. So I will move this over to our moderator to take the public testimony.
Thank you, Chair Buck. At this time, I would like to ask everybody who would like to give public testimony to please raise their virtual hand, and I will call upon you to give testimony. I will call your name, I will unmute you, and I will start the timer, and you may begin your public testimony. I will start with Rafael Seba. Mr. Seba, I am unmuting you, and you may start your public testimony. It looks like you are self-muted, Mr. Seba.
Thank you. Good afternoon, commissioners. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Excellent. My name is Rafael Seba. I am a right-of-way agent with the Eugene Water and Electric Board. Address is 4200 Roosevelt Boulevard, Eugene 97402. EWEB appreciates the opportunity to provide testimony for the proposed amendments to the county's floodplain regulations. As background, EWEB owns more than 1,000 acres in the Mackenzie River Valley. These holdings include a number of utility facilities, some of which are located in close proximity to the river and its floodplain. Certain upriver facilities are located in or near the floodplain because of required proximity to other infrastructure, such as the hydroelectric generation plants, which are locationally dependent on the canals, and certain substations, which are dependent upon the generation plants or on proximity to transmission lines. Other upriver facilities are located within the river itself due to their inherent function, such as dams, diversion structures, or water intakes. As such, some of our facilities are subject to the county's floodplain regulations. EWEB carefully balances environmental and risk considerations with the need to maintain and expand existing infrastructure. EWEB goes to great lengths to reduce environmental impacts, preserve riparian and riverine functions, and to maintain risk to minimize the risk to our facilities from flooding. At the same time, EWEB depends on having flexibility to be able to respond to changing customer demand, resource needs, and resource availability. As noted in the staff report, EWEB provided testimony and participated in the Planning Commission's public hearing process. EWEB had specific concerns with the initial code language related to the prohibition on development in the floodway and the critical facilities provision and definition. At the Planning Commission's explicit direction, staff worked with EWEB to resolve these issues. The code, as it is now proposed in the board packet, adequately addresses EWEB's concerns. EWEB appreciates the board and Planning Commission's consideration, as well as staff's thoughtful responsiveness to our concerns with this complex and nuanced code amendment. I thank you for your time.
Thank you for your public comment, Mr. Seba. I will now, one moment, call on Jeff Ziller. Mr. Ziller, I will unmute your microphone and start the timer. It looks like you are self-muted, Mr. Ziller, and you may begin your public comment.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, County Commissioners. For the record, I'm Jeff Ziller, District Fish Biologist for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I live at 3487 Walton Lane in Eugene, 97408. I'm thanking you for this opportunity to comment on floodplain combining zone for the floodplain code modernization project. I've also provided a letter with more extensive comments to the Commission. I'm a long-term resident of the area, attending local schools and Lane Community College. I did graduate from Oregon State University with a bachelor's degree in fisheries science in 1976. For the past 30 years, I've held the position of district fish biologist for the Upper Willamette Fish District for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. In this position, I manage fish populations in Eastern Lane County, including the responsibility of reviewing development plans, making recommendations to minimize impacts to fish and wildlife resources. I'm grateful that Lane County is in the process of revising the code that has gratuitously allowed development in river corridors, causing unnecessary risk to developments and tremendous harm to aquatic and riparian habitats. Rivers are much more than a low water channel we observe in the summer months. In Oregon, the water belongs to the people of the state and flows both above and below ground. On the surface, waters stretch across floodplain during the rainy months, creating new channels and habitat complexity for our diverse Northwest aquatic organisms. These include recreationally and culturally important species such as rainbow, cutthroat, bull trout, and Willamette spring chinook, as well as lesser known fish such as Oregon chub and Pacific lamprey. Bull trout and Willamette spring chinook salmon have experienced steep population declines and have been classified as threatened on the endangered species list. Over my 50+ years of residing, recreating, and working in this area, I've witnessed a dramatic reduction in the amount of floodplain habitat available to our native fish species and subsequent declines in the populations. Many of our river corridors have been severely narrowed and habitat simplified because of developments encroaching into the floodplain. I've made numerous recommendations to Lane County Land Management against floodplain development, and none of these recommendations have been sustained, mainly because of the ambiguity and exceptions processes in the code language. Unfortunately, I've also witnessed developments I recommended against building in the floodplain captured by flooding. In the past 3 decades, the language of the code has not allowed Lane County land use managers the clear guidance I believe we need to natural resource production. I encourage you to make strong policy for the floodplain protection by providing a more rigid code that limits the potential for developments in the floodplain. To this end, I believe you should strongly
Thank you for
consider
your
the
public comment.
by George Greer
Your
and
3
Tom.
minutes has expired, Mr. Ziller.
Thanks.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next speaker will be Madeline Cohen. I will unmute your microphone and you may begin your public comment. Again, you appear to be self-muted at this time.
Hello, can you hear me? Cool. Hi there. Thank you, commissioners and board. My name is Madeline Cowan. I work for a nonprofit organization called Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology, or FUSE for short, located in Eugene. My comments are short here today. I'm also a resident of Lane County, and I strongly believe that we must protect our iconic rivers, including the Willamette and the Mackenzie, which provide wildlife habitat, recreation opportunities, and fresh water to our communities. I encourage you to follow an organization that my organization partners with, Cascadia Wildlands, their recommendations to prohibit new development and dwelling construction in the mapped and designated floodway. This is similar to what Yamhill, Marion, and Deschutes counties have enacted, and limit any improvements to existing development in the floodway to the existing footprint. I also encourage you to prohibit channel hardening, including cement liners and riprapping of the stream bank, which increases stream main stem velocity that in turn significantly alters river function and threatens downstream properties. And finally, I encourage you to establish a Lane County floodway enforcement team to meaningfully enforce the code revision that includes significant fines for violating the floodway safeguards. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next speaker will be, let me get through here, Robert Emmons. Mr. Emmons, I will unmute your microphone and you may begin your public testimony. Mr. Emmons, I do show yourself muted.
Now, can you hear me? You can, all right.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, and good afternoon, Commissioners. Robert Emmons, 40093 Little Fall Creek Road in Fall Creek. I am offering the following perspective on my own behalf, but also on behalf of Land Watch Lane County. My comments are meant to be introductory and brief with the assumption that others will expand and add to them. And like a number of other people participating today, I want to focus, as Keir anticipated, on the county's part of the regulation dealing with the floodway. And so I think, again, it's important to reiterate a little bit of what Rachel was pointing out a little earlier about what a floodway actually is and does. And that's just to remind everybody, it's an area that should be kept free of obstructions in order to allow floodwaters to move downstream. And so for most rivers and streams, that's the place where the water is likely to be the deepest and the fastest. So placing fill or buildings in a floodway may and certainly can be anticipated to block the flow of water. Also increase flood heights and thereby increase the risk of life and property. I want to say that we appreciate the effort staff has made to strengthen floodplain provisions, but we're still disturbed by the proposed regulation that permits a number of exceptions that continue to allow development in the floodway. And obviously this provides a lot of latitude for floodway impacts. And yet at the same time, FEMA discourages development in the floodway and encourages states and communities to adopt regulation that actually permits, that goes beyond the National Flood Insurance Program's minimum requirements. It's also worth pointing out that Lane County would receive a big discount through the community rating system for keeping building out of the floodplain, not just the floodway. So I would point out that now's the time for Lane County to consider prohibiting floodway development as a matter of giving rather than taking. I know lingering in the background of all of the deliberations is the concern about takings. But let's look at the giving of assurance to property owners that their homes will not be sited in high-risk flood areas. Giving some assurance to the general public their insurance rates will not continue to rise as a result of claims paid for loss of property and life, and giving a pass to fish and other wildlife that depend on the natural flow of floodways and thus the integrity of floodplains for their survival. A prohibition of building in the floodway is an obvious and timely step to take when all of our rural landscape, and especially our riverbanks and floodplains, are highly sought for housing.
Your 3 minutes has expired.
Okay. Thank you. I urge you to keep development out of the floodway. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your public testimony. Our next speaker will be Mackenzie Bowerman. Mackenzie, I will unmute your microphone and you may begin your public comment.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Can you hear me okay? My name is Mackenzie Bowerman, 532 Olive Street, Eugene, Oregon, 97401. I am a lifelong resident of Lane County. I have businesses in Oak Ridge and Eugene. I also own property within the floodplain. The draft code will allow development in the river floodway through 4 exceptions. Lane County, Oregon, and federal jurisdictional literature repeatedly comment that flood zones are extreme risk to health and safety. Quoting just several of these statements, quote, "It is recommended that floodway development be discouraged or even prohibited because of the hazardous nature of this area," end quote, FEMA. Quote, "The National Flood Insurance Program encourages states and communities to implement floodplain management programs that go beyond NFIP minimum requirements," end quote, FEMA. Quote, "Any floodplain management regulations adopted by a state or community which are more restrictive are encouraged and shall take precedence," end quote, CFR 44. Under the title, Limiting Development in the Most Hazardous Areas of the Floodplain, FEMA states, quote, "Since floodways include the stream channel and the adjacent areas of the floodplain, they tend to include the most hazardous areas of the floodplain with the greatest depths and velocities of floodwaters and amount of debris. These areas pose a threat to public safety and are best avoided. If floodways were developed, the likely result would be buildings isolated by deep and fast floodwaters that may jeopardize the safety of any building occupants as well as that of public safety employees conducting search and rescue operations, end quote. Lane County's existing Natural Hazards Mitigation Plan of 2018 already assumes that Lane County, quote, ensures that encroachments do not occur within the regulated floodway, end quote. The FEMA Community Rating System document includes these statements, each of which are rewarded with points in the rating system. Quote, guarantee that currently open public or private floodplain parcels will be kept free from development, end quote, 2020 possible points. Quote, limit the new buildings and or fill within the floodplain, end quote, 2042 possible points. And quote, acquire and or relocate flood-prone buildings so that they are out of the floodplain, end quote, 2,250 possible points. It is clear that prohibiting development within the floodway is sensible for life safety and has co-benefits to broader public values and encouraged by higher jurisdictions. I ask that you send the draft ordinance back to staff with recommendations to draft an outright floodway prohibition based upon public safety. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next speaker will be Sean Malone. Mr. Malone, I will unmute you and you may begin your public comment.
Thank you and good afternoon to the Board of Commissioners. I'm here to talk about the issue of takings under Measure 49 in federal law. Staff expressed concern that prohibiting floodway development may trigger a Measure 49 or federal takings claim for compensation against the county. While someone could theoretically file a Measure 49 takings claim based on a floodway development prohibition, that claim would clearly fail provided that the regulatory language and intent of the ordinance is rooted in the public health and safety exception in Measure 49. When Measure 49 was adopted, the intent was not to prohibit all new land use regulations. In fact, there's an express intent to allow for new land use regulations that provide for the protection of public health and safety. This is spelled out in the plain language of ORS 195.305. That provision states, if a public entity enacts one or more land use regulations that restrict the residential use of private real property and that reduce the fair market value of property, then the owner of that property shall be entitled to just compensation from the public entity that enacted the land use regulations. And subsection 3 states that subsection 1 of this section shall not apply to land use regulations that were enacted prior to the claimant's acquisition date or to the land use regulations that restrict or prohibit activities for the protection of public health and safety. Now, protection of public health and safety is defined in ORS 195.300, subsection 21, and it specifically provides for flood hazards. It states, protection of public health and safety means a law, rule, ordinance, order, policy, permit, or other governmental authorization that restricts a use of property in order to reduce the risk or consequence of fire, earthquake, landslide, flood, storm, pollution, disease, crime, and so on. But the important part there is flood. On the issue of, and just to note that I've been keeping track of these things for the better part of 10 years. Measure 49 was an issue that I litigated early on. So I've been keeping track of subsequent claims for compensation based on new land use regulations. And there haven't really been many. But just recently, a claim was made in Tillamook County against a ordinance promulgated for the Nescoin Coastal Hazards Overlay Zone. And a claim for compensation was submitted to the county, and the county rejected that claim based on this exception that we're talking about here. And in terms of federal regulation, I think it's important to recognize, as was already said, that there are other counties that more strictly regulate this, and those counties aren't being pummeled with regulatory takings claims on a federal level. So in summation, I think the county has the authority and would be very much able to defeat any sort of claim for compensation based on the public health and safety exception. Thank you. Oh, excuse me.
Thank you for your public.
I have someone else with me on the line if later on Ms. Lori Siegel from Landwatch Lane County could be called on my account here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Robert Spencer. Mr. Spencer, I will unmute your microphone and begin your timer.
Okay, hello commissioners. Hope you can all hear me. I'm Robert Spencer. I'm president of Mackenzie Watershed Protective, Post Office Box 15, VITA 97488. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I'm going to speak directly and very plainly because that's just kind of the guy that I am. The idea, the proposal for this floodplain is a bad idea. In particular, the Mackenzie River is a river that's already under threat and in decline. This proposal, if it goes forward, is going to cause life safety problems in two regards. One is with flooding. We've had two major floods in the last 25 years on that river. Development in the floodplain area, you're going to be putting people at risk in structures in those areas, as well as access to those structures. And the other issue is with water quality. I don't see anything in this proposal that addresses water quality. You can't work in the floodplain without affecting water quality. And I don't see anything in this proposal addressing that, as well as any riparian language. Now, I have heard from county administrators that riparian issues are on the agenda in the future. Well, that may be, but if you're writing the law now and binding the county to laws that affect the riparian zone, then you've limited yourself as to what you can do in the future for the riparian issues. And to be quite honest with you, Lane County is doing nothing to protect the riparian zones on the Mackenzie River. It is of the 36 reports that we have filed, the complaints that we filed with Lane County, if you were to view those properties today, even the ones that have been addressed by Lane County, not one of them shows any improvement or change. So I have no reason to believe that this proposal would have any change on the riparian areas. So I would refer you to Mr. Tom Bowerman's report that he has submitted to the commissioners, and please take a look at that and read it seriously. I think this report is very good. I think this proposal, building in the floodplain, it's just a bad idea and it needs to be reviewed. I don't know of one government agency, state or federal, that supports this. So let's take a look at this and figure out how to make this right. Thank you.
Thank you for your public testimony. Our next testimony will come from Josh Laughlin. Josh, I will unmute your microphone and you may begin your public testimony.
Great, can you hear me okay? Chair Buck and Lane County Board of Commissioners, my name's Josh Laughlin. I'm a 27-year resident of Eugene and the Executive Director of Cascadia Wildlands, testifying on behalf of our 12,000 members and supporters, many of which reside here in Lane County. Thank you for the opportunity today to testify. This is a particularly significant issue for our membership. Iconic waterways like the Mackenzie and Willamette and their unique tributaries flow through our county and are really the lifeblood of our special region. As you all know, originating in the high Cascades and lava fields in eastern Lane County, the Mackenzie provides arguably some of the best drinking water in the country to approximately 200,000 downstream residents. People from around the world flock to the upper Mackenzie and Willamette River systems to hike the trails, fish the riffles, raft the whitewater, and camp with their families. These activities drive our local recreation economy. The bike shops, the gas stations, the fish and rafting outfitters, the grocery stores, the hospitality industry. It's all about the clean water. The river systems in Lane County also provide habitat to an imperiled salmon run. The demise of our iconic salmon is the consequence of a death by 1,000 cuts. While teetering on the brink of extinction, the upper Willamette Chinook salmon that makes its historic journey back to its natal spawning grounds from the Pacific Ocean can't keep taking cuts. With population growth in Lane County and subsequent floodway development, the pressure just keeps getting more intense on this defining and revered feature of our shared landscape. Cascadia Wildlands encourages the Lane County Board of Commissioners to adopt revisions to the floodplain code that, 1, prohibit new development and dwelling construction in the mapped and designated floodway, and limit any improvements to existing development in the floodway to the existing footprint. 2, prohibit channel hardening. You've seen it before. This includes modifying the stream bank with massive boulders and cement liners. This increases main stem velocity that in turn significantly alters river function and threatens downstream properties. 3, establish a Lane County floodway oversight team to meaningfully enforce the code revision. In conclusion, Cascadia Wildlands believes the Lane County Board of Commissioners has a unique opportunity to institute common sense protection measures for our outstanding waterways in Lane County while still honoring property owner rights. We need foresight now from the Lane County Commission. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you for your public testimony. Our next speaker will be Lori Segal. I will unmute Mr. Malone's microphone and Ms. Segal may begin her testimony. I do show you are self-muted.
Sorry about that. Blame it on Sean. This is Lori Segal speaking on behalf of Landwatch Lane County. Your staff report explains the proposed amendments are a response to a DLCD community assistance visit, the CAV. Although no summary report of the visit is provided, and we ask that one be provided into the record. The staff report states the CAV found, quote, Lane County's floodplain program was compliant with the NFIP, end quote, and recommended Lane County update the floodplain combining zone to better reflect their verbatim language of the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 44. The relevant portions of the CFR 44 aren't cited. However, it does appear verbatim language has not been incorporated. The NFIP recommends standards that exceed the minimum, recognizing some local officials may not agree. Quote, the NFIP encourages states and communities to implement floodplain management programs that go beyond NFIP minimum requirements, since local flood hazards vary and what makes sense in one state or community may not make sense in another. While some local officials may feel this approach is too restrictive, it's important to note that emergency response personnel die every year attempting to rescue flood-stranded citizens. Also, others may die or be seriously injured because they cannot be rescued in time, end quote. The NFIP higher regulatory standards include safety requirements for critical facilities, hazardous materials, and dry land access. The proposed amendments include language regarding protection of critical facilities and related hazardous material storage. However, the existing language addressing dry land access is proposed for removal without adequate justification or even any discussion at the Planning Commission because they apparently chose not to discuss the issue. Landwatch requests the board direct staff to reinstate the language for safe vehicle access to new dwellings built in the floodway and floodplain. The written explanation for removal of safe road access language is not in the the language is not in the DLCD model code. notwithstanding the draft elsewhere as a number of non-model code proposals. It has been suggested the removal is due to an LMD practice of not considering the provisions because of a position about road access impacts on fish passage and other downstream impacts. However, neither reason has been discussed and do not appear to have a basis in practice. And we ask that the record, as has been discussed, remain open. We don't need a continuation of the hearing necessarily. Thank you.
Thank you for your public testimony. I do have one person left at this time for presenting public testimony. If there is anybody else that would like to give public testimony following this speaker, please raise your hand and I will call upon you. Our next speaker is Tom Bowerman. Mr. Bowerman, I will unmute your microphone and you may begin your public testimony.
Can you hear me? Oh, thank you.
Yes.
My name is Tom Bowerman, and I live at 33707 Mackenzie View, Lane County, of course. I have a professional planning, education, and employment experience. I have lived on the same land here near the Mackenzie River in Lane County for over 65 years, co-founding the Mackenzie River Trust. I have seen many changes and some very severe floods. I have clocked full-size logs traveling at approximately 25 miles per hour during high water events in the floodway. Imagine that going by a house or connecting with a house. Over the last year, I've been deeply involved in Lane Code 16.244 and related laws and practices, and I've always wanted to leave this place equal or better than what it once was or when I arrived here. I don't think we're doing a great job with that. I have provided 6 recommendations in the public record containing extensive citations in law and public policy supporting the recommendations. I agree that there are some improvements in the draft floodplain protections. However, the draft revisions are as yet insufficient to meet the goal of best practices, life safety, and river protection, and I don't think they're ready for prime time yet. I'm going to go kind of off record now, kind of ad lib or extemporaneous, and just say, comment on the Marion County. That was my mistake. It was in a draft that I circulated 3 or 4 weeks ago. Further work on it for the final, picked that up, and it was removed. On the Deschutes County, that's a surprise to me that Rachel Surslev says that they also allow it. That's certainly not my reading. I'm going to look at that more closely. I'll send it out for an independent reading. 2 of us have read it. We don't read it that way. We think that their code is clean and elegant in the way that it's written. In fact, their floodplain ordinance is 10 pages long, while Lane County's is 32 pages long. It's worth considering why that is. And if we get this put back to the staff, I would love to work with them on simplifying the code. I think Lane County's code is filled with ambiguities, and this isn't just in the new language. It's I went through a appeal process on an approval from the Lane staff, and that was reversed on that appeal. And so I think that's evidence just in the last year that we could do better, and we must do better, and we must do better protecting this river. I think that's about it. The road access, I guess I just want to touch on that.
I'm sorry, your 3 minutes just expired. At this time, that is all I show for public comment. If there's anyone else who would like to make public comment, you can raise your hand now and I will call on you. I do not see any more hands going up, so I will turn the meeting back over to you, Chair Buck.
Very good. Thank you, everybody, for your public testimony. And we'll move to additional comments by staff.
Thank you, Chair Buck. This is Rachel Surslove again. I don't have anything additional to add at this point, just to again mention that there is a revision that must be made due to some FEMA policy changes. And so that revision must be made to the proposed draft, and we'd request to continue the hearing and keep the record open in order to do that.
Very good. So now it's open to discussion and action by the board. Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to ask some questions.
I'm sorry, Commissioner, just to, I apologize for interrupting, but I just got information from staff that there might be one more person that wanted to testify.
Okay.
Is that right, Diana?
Let's hear from.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair Buck.
I'll let you start again,
let me get the. It's Mr. George Greer. One moment, I need to get the timer back up. I saw your email that your hand was raised, but it doesn't show raised for me, so I did not see you. So one moment, and I will get the timer back up and start your testimony. One moment. Mr. Greer, I'm going to unmute you and I'll get a timer started. One moment. You are unmuted, Mr. Greer, and you may begin your public testimony, and I will get the timer over there so you can see it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the board and county staff for their incredible efforts with the pandemic. Thank you very much. My name is George Greer. I've lived at 1342 and a half 66th Street in Springfield for over 45 years. My property is within and adjacent to the floodplain and floodway of the McKenzie River and Cedar Creek. My time in the Lane County Planning Commission, the McKenzie Watershed Council, and the McKenzie River Trust have provided me with experience in floodplain dynamics and regulation. You have a very meaty set of issues before you. I provided you with more in-depth written testimony. Today, I would like to offer some perspective that will hopefully aid you in your decision-making. Pandemics and floods share a lot in common. They don't happen very often, but when they do, they're generally catastrophic. They are dynamic and complicated events. Lessons learned are often forgotten. The flood maps we rely on assume that the levee and dam protection constructed over 60 years ago is still intact and capable of functioning. In fact, much of it is at the end of its lifespan. The county must take that into account, that the protection afforded by our flood control infrastructure is no longer reliable, and that a cautious and conservative approach is called for. A major flood event is dynamic and complex. The engineering models that we rely on depict future flood elevations only at the most simple levels. As the current COVID crisis has shown, for complex and dynamic events, the difference between modeled and actual outcomes can be significant. The county should evaluate its dependency on modeled assumption and increase their rigor. There are actually two floodways, the regulated floodway and the actual observed floodway. Much of the high velocity discharge may actually occur outside the mapped floodway and is typically not modeled. The county should reduce this potential problem by prohibiting all development in the floodway. Cumulative fill in the floodplain is an enormous problem. The county should consider cumulatively tracking all fill, not just lot by lot. A 5-year tracking period for individual lots is insufficient to control significant creep. The county should instead adopt a no-rise requirement. Access roads to development have the potential to elevate flood levels more than the development itself and create significant problems for adjacent landowners. I commend staff for its recommendation to remove the road elevation requirement. I would urge you to take the time to understand the complex issues before you. Adopt a conservative approach and err on the side of safety. These changes may not have an impact until the next major flood event, but that day will come. And as recent events have underscored, long-term planning, even for low probability and infrequent events, is rewarded. To the extent you're able to limit the impact of the next major flood, you will have done a good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your public testimony. Chair Buck, at this time, I do show that it's all of the public testimony, so I will turn it back over to you.
Very good. Thank you all for allowing one more testimony, and I'll move it back to Commissioner Sorensen.
Thanks very much. I have a series of questions, and the first one is I want to follow up on the community assistance visit. It wasn't entirely clear to me who visited. Obviously, Lane County was visited, but I'm wondering if staff could clarify, number one, who was visiting, and number two, did they send any report? Did they send any records, any email, anything that would provide some sort of contemporaneous what happened during the visit?
Yes, I can give you an answer to that. So Department of Land Conservation and Development, acting on behalf of FEMA, visited with Lane County's certified floodplain managers, and they reviewed our floodplain code and our floodplain permit processing. And there are reports and records. I do believe that the follow-up letter from DLCD was provided attached to a the initial planning commission staff report, but it can be provided again to you all.
I think that would be helpful, and thank you for that answer. With regard to Zone A, Zone AE, and the floodway, do you have mapping or do you have mapping on each of those for what is in Zone A, what is in Zone AE, or what is in the floodway? How many acres are we talking about? And do you have precise maps to show the public where these lands are located throughout the county?
Yes, so there are precise maps on Lane County GIS that generally show the mapped flood hazard areas. I don't have on hand what acres of what zoned type of lands exist within what flood zone, but that is readily available to the public to see what areas of the county are in what flood zone.
Could you provide a letter to the board that states the number of acres or approximate number of acres for each of those categories, Zone A, Zone AE, and floodway?
Sure.
I mean, how much work is that, and how long would that take?
I think it would be a pretty quick collaboration with Lane County GIS to have them run a query to figure out how many acres are within each of those flood zones. I don't think it would be a tremendous amount of work.
Okay, and with regard to the impact of continuing to allow the development in the floodplain and floodway, commented on by several people in the public hearing, that there's been a dramatic reduction in fish habitat. Lane County is not doing anything to protect the riparian areas of the McKenzie River. Protection of public health and safety is vital, as it is a flood hazard. What kind of numbers or way do you have to document that risk to the public? It was specifically mentioned that, you know, people have to be rescued when there's floods. So is there any way to compute that, Ms. Surslow?
I'm not sure I have specific data on individuals who needed to be rescued during a flood hazard event. I could provide, and I think I have provided in past planning commission staff reports, the number of floodway permits that we've issued and for what type of development that floodway permit was issued for. And so I could point you to that or provide it again.
I think that would be helpful, and to the extent that we're able to document our record we should be making it clear that we're enacting this ordinance. If we do enact it, we're enacting it to protect public health and safety. And I wanted to, last but not least, comment on the issue of, and have you comment on, is there any reference to the change in our weather, the change in our climate that's resulting in higher numbers of flood events and the more dangerous flood events caused by changes in climate? Is that a component of why we should be enacting this ordinance if we strengthen it?
It's not a specific stance or justification that staff has provided.
Is it something that you could document or provide in terms of the report of the state climatologist or scientists at Oregon State University that are studying and to some extent commenting on the decrease in snow falling in the winter, but also increasing the melt of snow and thereby causing increased flooding?
Chair Buck and Commissioner Sorensen, this is Keir Miller. If I could take a shot at responding to that question. So Land Management Division is a participating member in the National Flood Insurance Program. So all of the flood studies, flood analysis, and risk maps are developed at the federal level, and those are the maps that we rely upon. That modeling, as of yet, hasn't taken into account climate change. We do, I mean, it's an expansive set of studies and maps, and it would be a major lift to evaluate, that sort of amount of data into our flood studies. I'm not saying it couldn't be done, but it's best done, in my opinion, at a national level where those maps are developed. We have very limited ability to implement new flood study areas. It's very cost prohibitive. What we can do is develop more rigorous flood protection standards. And as was discussed earlier, this concept of being, more stringent because the analysis is inherently faulty in some regards. So taking a higher measure of protection with regards to the standards, as opposed to trying to develop the climate change data or adjusting our models based on that. That's just something we frankly don't have the capacity to do.
Okay, well, I'll just conclude by saying I'm in favor of increasing the public safety component of our proposal, and I'm in favor of keeping the record open so staff and any commenter can provide additional information that would be useful to the board. And one final thing, and that is what would be the opportunity for another public hearing on this ordinance. And I'll just leave it as a statement at this point for commissioners to give their views on. Thank you so much.
Any other discussion, comments, questions? Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. So I guess my first question is, staff is recommending that we approve this reading and set a third reading and continued public hearing. I missed the date and time certain for that continued public hearing, if it gets to the point where we're making motions.
That's October 6th at 1:30.
Okay. Quick question for staff. Does this update restrict floodplain and floodway development more than our current code?
Yes, I would say that floodway is being restricted more than the current code. Floodplain is not substantially changing.
Okay, still, it's a more restrictive code. I just want to make sure that was clear because a lot of the public testimony sounded like our revisions were actually going to allow more by the tone of how some things were stated. Second question is, in the exemption in Measure 49 for things that involve public health and safety, if we're going beyond the minimum requirements of a federal agency for protecting people against flood hazards, could somebody argue that that is actually not a public health and safety regulation? It's just purely a restriction because the minimum standards that the federal government sets to protect people have already been met. And this may be a legal counsel question.
Yeah, I would look to.
If Andy's on the line, maybe he could respond to that.
I am on the line. I assume you can hear me unless you start waving your arms around. I can't say for sure, Commissioner Bozovich. We would have to take a closer look at that, and we can do it if necessary. For what it's worth, at this time, I think the health and safety concept is probably broad enough to include the regulations Lane County is contemplating. In other words, I don't think that the federal law creates sort of a high watermark, if you will, for what is or what isn't. I don't think there's a bright line. I see you smiling, Commissioner Farr. Sorry about that pun. I don't think there's a bright line between the federal regulations and the state or county stuff. I think it all can fit within that health and safety rubric, especially considering that Measure 49 or the statute promulgated from that are, of course, state law and distinct, therefore, from what the feds contemplate. But to be clear, we would need to take a closer look at how broad that category of regulation, health and safety regulations is.
Yeah, it's, one of the things that I'm concerned about is, some of these regulations can be considered somewhat arbitrary about how we set them. And we could choose to do 5 feet of elevate at ground level for, structures instead of 3 feet and adjacent ground. How do we justify the difference? And what is just purely regulatory and what is truly for safety? We just have to be careful with that. I'm just bringing this up as a precautionary statement that it's not cut and dried. If you say the words public health and safety, that protects you from a takings claim.
And to add in, I would agree with that. And I think what the subject indicates to me is that we would want to probably have some findings to go along with this ordinance about how we came to certain measures such as that and sort of why it's necessary or beneficial to public health and safety.
Yeah. So, just a quick comment or two. I'm probably the only person, including our staff, that has ever done a floodplain analysis and actually established and done the studies for no net rise for a house that was built on the Mohawk right before the 1996 floods that stayed 2 feet above the 500-year flood that ran down the Mohawk that year. I also have done those on both coasts and understand the difference between the storm events on one coast versus another. And I will tell you that there's a much more ability to have precision with Pacific style storms than there are with what happens on the Atlantic coast. And the modeling has been around since the 70s, basically 50 years, and is consistently tested against new storm events, as well as it was originally calibrated against prior storm events that they had elevation readings and historic flood elevations. It's not such an inexact science. Yes, you may see differences of tenths of foot or something in flood elevations, but it is at least well studied, well calibrated, and has a whole lot less variables than climate modeling. And I'll just say, I have a lot of trust in what FEMA has done in this area as far as designating floodways and floodplains. Particularly as they've updated in like the Siuslaw River areas with much more detailed topography, their floodway maps and flood zone maps. Just so the public understands that, because there was a lot of testimony taking aim at inaccuracies or questioning of the floodway maps. I don't have that lack of confidence in that mapping. All that said, I was supportive of moving ahead with looking at these ordinances because there is a little bit, too easily developed floodway in particular in this county, and I want to see us continue down this road. And when it's time, I will make a motion for us to continue this public hearing and come back later to complete our discussion on this. I will say also that quite a bit of information was sent to us after 4 p.m. last night, pages worth, and I don't feel like even if we weren't continuing the public hearing, I wouldn't be able to make a decision today because I haven't been able to digest particularly all the public comment we got in writing from people like Mr. Bowerman and Mr. Greer. I just have not had time to read and digest those letters in detail. I appreciate them providing that level of detail and comment.
Any other comment? I have some questions of my own for staff. Commissioner Burney, do you want to go first?
Actually, it doesn't matter. If you'd call on me when you're done your questions, that would be great. Either way.
Okay, I'll do that. So in the public testimony, somebody mentioned that we have 4 exemptions to development in the floodway. I believe that's what it was stated. And I wanted to know what those were. I'm additionally interested in the other public comment, which mentioned that Deschutes County had 10 pages of regulations and we had 20 or 30 some. And of course, I like simplification. I think it's easier for people to understand. And so I'm curious as to why ours is so much longer. I can only guesstimate that it's because we have additional exemptions, but I don't know. And I'm not a professional in this code by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm wondering if somebody can speak to those 2 items.
Yes, I can definitely speak to those. In regards to the other floodplain ordinances that have been brought up, I haven't looked into when Deschutes or Marion County adopted those, but I know that Yamhill's County's code is older and they have not gone through their community assistant visit yet with FEMA. And the reason this draft code is so lengthy is because we are basing it off of the model ordinance that DLCD has. And that model ordinance is quite lengthy, but also I am of the opinion that our current floodplain code leaves a lot of processes uncodified. And so I believe that the DLCD model code adds in a lot more of the process and makes it explicit, the permit process that is to be followed when issuing permits for floodplain development. And so I think that's one of the reasons that it is quite a bit longer. In response to your other question about the 4 exemptions, I don't know exactly where that, I had that written down as well. I don't know exactly where that is coming from in the public testimony. The floodway provision, as it's written and presented to you, prohibits construction, reconstruction, or reconstruction of residential structures within the designated floodway, except for certain repairs that do not increase the ground area. And then there is two what I could see as possible exceptions. One for locationally dependent structures. So if there's an existing development, residential development in the floodway, and an individual needed or wanted to establish some sort of accessory development to that already existing development, this provision would allow them to do that. And the situation that brought this provision about is if you have existing development in the floodway, would it be overbearing to then require accessory development to be located out of the floodway if an area outside of the floodway exists thousands or hundreds of feet away from the existing development? It seemed that that would be an undue burden. So that's a provision that exists in the code that could be seen as an exemption. The other one is reads, when there's no feasible or practicable location that exists outside of the floodway. So that is an exception when a property is entirely floodway. They would be allowed to establish a residential structure in the floodway with a no-rise certification because they have no other option for developing that property. So that could be an exception that they're viewing.
What comes to my mind over and over as we talk about this is the picture I was given from a McKenzie River resident going down, floating in the river. And, you know, there's houses alongside the river, and somebody added a mobile home within like 20 feet, it seemed, of the river. And it didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. To me, building that close to the river is a life safety issue, which we'll become responsible for during a flood event. And I just want to, say to my fellow commissioners, I'm not interested in seeing development in the floodway. And if we have exemptions, I want to make sure that it is for a life safety requirement. I did listen to the eWeb utility company. I understand we're good partners with eWeb. I understand that they need to get to and from their utility equipment, and they feed water, to the majority of the Metro Center. So I just want to know that those exemptions that we have in place for development in a floodway are for life and safety, because there's no way I would want to live on the river, but I know a lot of people do. In the long run, the river's going to move. It's going to move where it wants to move, not from where we want it to move to. Even if we try to put in fill or we try to do channel hardening, which I've been learning a lot about in the last few months, the river, my husband works on the ocean, right? The water will go where it wants to go, and you will not be able to move it over time. It will, what we think, encroach in our space when we are encroaching in its space. And I don't want to put any of our residents in danger. Commissioner Berney.
Well, that's a hard act to follow. Thanks a lot. I know all about hardening of arteries, but yes, I'm learning also about the hardening of walls on the river. Here's what I would like to say. I don't have Commissioner Bozovich's credentials in this subject, and this subject reminds me of another subject my first year where, I keep wanting information and it's almost overwhelming. But I'm starting to figure some of this out. I do know a little about utilities. So I would like to actually say to the gentleman to use it, Mr. Seba from EWEB, to use this as to illustrate a point. If the Board of Commissioners voted to prohibit all development in the floodway, and EWEB went to extra costs as it related to its utility development, and even if it had to go to extra costs to reach the transmission lines, which it has placed there, what that does is add to the cost to the ratepayer. If EWEB is asking us not in that scenario to add to the cost of the EWEB ratepayer, and yet we're trying to act in the interests of safety and health, I find that a little difficult. And the reason I don't expect this to be popular, but the reason I do is because that becomes a subsidy. That becomes a subsidy to the cost of electricity. EWEB, in 30 years I've been here, bought a multi-million-dollar software system that failed about 20-some years ago. That was passed on to the cost of electricity to the consumer. EWEB has entered into a PPA with one of our local companies. At the time, that might have seemed like a good idea. Right now, EWEB is losing hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on that. It's passed on to the consumer. So I want to get back to the focus here. And from what I'm learning and my inclination, I'm going to either second or agree with Commissioner Bozovich's motion to continue on. But as I look at it right now, I have heard none of the proposals that multiple people have said as really all that controversial. It's health, it's safety, it's environmental. Newsflash, the climate is changing. Newsflash, we're not going to get as much snow as the mountains. We're going to get a lot more rain. Newsflash, there's going to be a lot more water traveling down from the mountains to the coast. It's going to be in those rivers. It's going to be moving fast. We don't have to model that. That's going to happen. So right now, I'm leaning towards asking staff to incorporate prohibition of new development, or at least be prepared for my input to really accept what I heard as it relates to hardening the footprint, as it relates to, I can't read it all, I apologize. But you know what I'm saying. I'm saying that it just seems that now is the time to take a stance that really is mature and adult and puts the public interest ahead of a few private interests. And finally, I would like to say that we also need to open up more land for development. It's not so controversial. We also need to build as it relates to housing and businesses and facilities. So actually these kind of relate to one another. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out. That's where I'm leaning on the basis of all the information I'm being given. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Bozovich?
So I first want to remind folks that it's very difficult to build an intake structure for a surface water utility like EWEB without constructing in the actual floodway. There has been some discussion that there needs to be a backup system to our entirely McKenzie dependent water system for almost 200,000 people. Are you not hearing me, Joe?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Joe may not be able to.
I'm sorry, Jay, I can hear you. You're a lot lower than everyone else. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize.
Okay, I'll try and speak up maybe, and that'll help. EWEB is looking at possibly doing a system on the Willamette River to back up their McKenzie River system. In order to build the intakes for that Willamette River system would also be in floodway construction. They have a legitimate concern, and so do other utilities, about being able to construct in the floodway. And I think that's one of those things when you talk about location-dependent development, that is definitively location-dependent in that exemption. It may be that the only place they can get a well on their property is to have the well house in the floodway, but that may not actually generate a flood hazard for them and their residents to have a well house in the floodway. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater sometimes. I'll just say that I have yet to see statistical evidence of changes in precipitation patterns and increases in flood events due to climate change. And when somebody provides me with one, I'll accept it. But data-wise, there has not been. People keep forgetting about the 40s and the 60s in Oregon and some of those flood events. Also, if we're talking about less snowpack, our largest flood in recent history was due to low elevation snowmelt combined with a precipitation event, a Pineapple Express. That was the 1996 floods. So if there isn't snow, you know, this giant supposition that some reason that's going to generate more flood events may not necessarily be true, because part of that potential for flood in this area is the combination of snowmelt and rainfall. So I just want to say, let's not confuse this whole issue with the unproven modeling of climate change, and talk about the well-established modeling around flood zones and floodways, and the calibrated models, and move ahead that way, and not indiscriminately, pull an exception without understanding really what it means. For EWEB maybe to improve their intakes as the city of Eugene grows, or what you're doing to an area like Mapleton that's sandwiched between hillsides that are susceptible to landslide, so there's a different hazard there, and wildfire, and a river system that has a floodplain and a floodway, and other areas of Lane County that are like that. Every place you live in this county has a hazard of some kind. And there has to be balances of those hazards. When we start blindly only focusing on a single hazard, going with blanket prohibitions, what we're saying is we're not helping people build needed housing. And we spent last board meeting talking about an affordable housing plan. So not that I'm promoting putting housing in floodway, but there is places where housing in floodplain is still safe. Because a lot of floodplain has almost zero velocity water and less than a foot deep. That's not what I really call something that's going to create life safety health issues. So we just need to be, judicious in how we do this, and not want to just make blanket adjustments. We're tightening the code with this, and I think we want to avoid jumping too far too fast. We can always come back and look at it again. With that, I'd like to move to approve the second reading and set the third reading and continue public hearing for October 6th, 2020 at a time certain of 1:30. For ordinance
We
number.
want to add the order number that goes with it.
Yeah, for ordinance number 20-08 and order 20-01813.
I'll second moving it forward.
Okay, we got a motion by Commissioner Bozovich, second by Commissioner Burney. Is there discussion? Commissioner Sorensen?
Are we going to be making any changes or asking staff to come back with the kind of improvements that Commissioner Buck and Commissioner Burney commented on? Or
I
is
did
it
not
just
hear that
continued?
from the motion.
Just continued hearing on what has already been proposed with the answers to the questions that we've posed in a new staff memo?
Commissioner Bozovich, do you want to clarify?
It was to move what's been presented today to a continued hearing for next time. I wasn't.
Will we get answers to the questions that we've posed in a staff memo?
I will certainly provide a staff memo that answers the questions posed today. And it would be helpful to staff if there were any revisions that the board would like to see made, that be expressed today. The only revision that staff is planning to make is the needed revision to the policy change from FEMA.
Commissioner Berney.
Sheepishly, having listened to what Commissioner Bozovich said, especially about utility, I'm open ears, sir, open ears. However, I would like to see a more simplified document. I don't know how to make this in the form of a motion. I'm floating it. I would like to see staff actually take Mr. Bowerman's expert testimony and work with him to develop a simpler statement that maybe was closer to 10 than 32 pages. And I personally would like to see us get much, much, much closer, if not to a prohibition on development in the floodway.
Commissioner Bozovich.
So my intent was to allow staff to make that change that they want to make, which is going to require us to do at least 2 more readings because we did not advertise that. If we do what Vice Chair Berney is suggesting, I'm going to ask that it go back to the Planning Commission and we start over, because that's basically a rewrite, and we haven't publicly advertised a shortened, condensed document. And at that point, I'm sure there's going to be multiple parties that want to be involved, and not just Mr. Bowerman in trying to shorten and condense. I will remind folks, we are the only county in the state that has to address all 19 statewide planning goals, because we are the only county in the state that has coastline and Willamette Greenway. So one of the things we deal with that no other county like Deschutes County or Yamhill County deal with is we have floodway that's coastal and has a different, coastal flood zones. So there may be a couple pages that maybe address that portion of FEMA's flood maps, that Deschutes and Yamhill don't deal with. So just counting pages when you're talking about a much more complex county, and has the Willamette Greenway overlays on almost all the floodway and flood zones beyond the floodplain combining zone. When you start talking about riparian protections and everything else, that's in addition. There's other places riparian protections get addressed. Deschutes County doesn't have any Willamette Greenway. So just saying that, don't try and put us in a box with Deschutes County.
I just want to add, I want to make a point that the motion that's on the table right now, if I understand this right, is to move forward the code the way that it's currently written with the one change that staff has mentioned. And it doesn't seem to me that if there's other revisions people want to do, that would be perceived as a friendly amendment to this particular motion. Now, Commissioner Bozovich, you can clarify that for me.
That's an accurate statement.
Okay. So, Commissioner Berney.
I apologize. In that case, I would like to remove the second.
Commissioner Sorensen.
I was thinking that maybe if we could give staff more direction, that the next public hearing would be not just the rerun of this public hearing. For example, as I understand it, eWeb wants to have the definition the way it is in the draft, and I don't see a need to allow them to build a nuclear power plant or set up a generating station or put a power utility pole or some sort of structure in the floodway. I could see that there might be some development that they could be a little more narrow about what it is they want to do rather than have just a blanket exemption for utilities. And as I understand it, that exemption would apply to all utilities, including natural gas development and pipelines and all kinds of other things that are within the definition of utility. So I'm really against that, and I would prefer to see a prohibition, as Commissioner Burney just mentioned. I'd prefer to see a prohibition. And then with regard to the other items in Mr. Bowerman's proposal, you know, I agree with Commissioner Burney. We ought to have LMD sit down with Mr. Bowerman and see what changes can be incorporated into the next draft.
Okay, so with the withdrawal of the second, we don't have a viable motion on the floor.
I'll second.
Okay, so we do have a separate second. Moved by Commissioner Bozievich, second by Commissioner Farr, for moving ahead as stated. And so we'll have discussion on this. Commissioner Sorensen.
I just think it's a good idea for us to defeat this motion and have a motion that does direct staff to make some changes. Otherwise, all we'll be doing is coming back for another public hearing on the same proposal that we have. So I would say the simplest thing to do is to have a vote on this. And if there is a no vote, then we would try to figure out what a plan would be and what we can agree to, what a motion could be agreed to have something change between now and the time that we have that next hearing.
I'll add that I would rather have revisions made as well. So I won't support the motion as is without additional revisions. Specifically, I want us to talk more about our floodway exemptions and a no-rise development clause in there. I think Mr. Guerra's points are well taken regarding road elevation, and specifically, there was a bill change by the Planning Commission from 7 cubic yards up to 50. I would like it to go back to where it was when it was presented to us originally. I don't know if we can all agree on where we want changes to go. Did somebody else have their hand up that I missed? So Commissioner Burney?
No, I probably will, but I think Commissioner Sorensen had his hand up.
Commissioner Bozievich did. Commissioner Sorensen just spoke.
I apologize for background noise here. My, thoughts about moving this ahead as is was that this is what has gone through our process with public hearing at the Planning Commission level and public hearing here also. I'll remind folks that MWMC has multiple facilities located in the floodplain and floodway. You can't get rid of sewage without getting into the floodway for the most part. And you can't, and generally when you put it in a sewage pump station, in order to have it downhill development, sometimes it's in the floodway. I designed and put one in the River Glen subdivision that was there just ahead of the 96 floods. And I watched the water elevation come up to 2 feet from the finished elevation of that site. So you can't operate a lot of municipal utilities and without having things in floodway. And a lot of those utilities have to actually be located outside the municipalities to serve them, to be downstream or to be far enough upstream for an intake. So our code impacts them. It's not just city land use code. So I just, again, a precaution, there's a reason why utilities want to have an exemption. And I don't think there's some, broad door we're opening with that. Pipelines do have to cross rivers. Sewage treatment plants do have to be located downstream and downhill of the community they're serving. Generally, water plants are upstream and uphill of the community they're serving because it makes it a lot cheaper to pump water into town. It's just, if you want to have urban development, you have to be willing to accept that there will be utilities in floodways and in floodplains.
Commissioner Berney.
Much as some might not like this, I think Commissioner Bozievich makes great points. And I think there ultimately will be exemptions. And I have no issue with that. But as it relates to some of the specifics that move us very close to a prohibition of most types of development in the floodway, I still, and I think what Chair Buck mentioned is completely consistent with that. And it's consistent with Mr. Greer's recommendations. I still will vote to see those kinds of things built into this. And I think Commissioner Bozievich is correct. There will be, of course, there will be some exemptions. And of course, it'll be longer than the mythic 10 pages simply by nature of all the planning considerations that have to be accommodated.
Any other discussion on the particular motion we have on the table? Okay, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay.
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 Okay, motion fails with Berney, Buck, and Sorensen in the nay. Is there an alternate motion somebody would like to make?
Buck, this is Staff Keir Miller. If I could provide just a little bit of information that might help educate an additional motion. I just want to point out regarding the critical facilities and the infrastructure piece, there is a way that we could craft the code so it's not a blanket exemption, but rather it's a type 2 review process where we could build in some criteria that, the utility demonstrates that there's, a public need and it minimizes impacts to the resource, et cetera. So there is certainly a way, if we receive directions, we could try to craft that for discussion at the next hearing. I'll also point out that it would be very challenging to reduce the code further than it is. The reason it's so long isn't due to exemptions, but it's due to other processes, additional regulations that apply to Lane County, and the majority of regulations are this long just based on the information that comes out of the CFRs, and we have those coastal overlays like Commissioner Bozievich mentioned and a number of other things. Some counties don't even have floodway, so all of that floodway language isn't in their code. So just a word of caution, if we are given that direction, we'll try our best, but that's what this whole code modernization project is about. It's about simplifying the code, and we're really working towards an eye on that. It's just in some cases we couldn't meet that mark. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. So is there an alternate motion from another commissioner? Commissioner Sorensen.
I move that the board direct staff to come back with a new ordinance that incorporates the comments that have been made by the commissioners today, most notably ways to restrict the development in the floodplain, except for benefits that Mr. Miller was describing for benefits in the floodway, and to ban additional construction in the floodplain and floodway, except for modifying buildings in the floodplain and protecting those buildings, property owners be allowed to do that. But I see this motion as being given some general direction to the department to put together another proposal.
Okay, is there a second to this motion?
I was hoping Pat would second it. I saw him leaning towards his computer. I will second it as I understand it.
Discussion, Commissioner Farr. You're on mute, Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. A clarification then from the maker of the motion, please. You said floodway and floodplain. Do you intend floodway and floodplain?
Yeah, this ordinance deals with both floodway and floodplain issues. And from my understanding of the testimony from the advocates for protecting the public health and safety, they are asking us to increase protections for floodplain and floodway. And so I want to make it clear that if we are putting together another draft, that we try to close some of those loopholes, and we try to have this ordinance be protective of public health and safety. And that is the purpose of this motion.
Then let me summarize that, if I may. You're saying that you're requesting that staff bring back a new ordinance, term you used, so not 2008 anymore, a new ordinance that restricts, that prohibits development in the floodplain as well as the floodway. Okay.
I would say no. Number one, it would be an amendment to this ordinance. So it would not be a new ordinance with a new number. However, it would be a modification of this proposed ordinance. And as the board is now working on the ordinance and trying to figure out if we want to do an ordinance at all or not, I think it is important that we pursue the ordinance. Staff has already said that they believe this ordinance as it was presented would be an improvement. I don't disagree with that. I just think that we can improve it further. And I think that if we get more aggressive about protecting public health and safety, and I'm telling you, I started on this board in January of 1997. This 1996-97 flood was no joke. There were houses floating down the Mackenzie River. So this is not something that we should be dealing with in some mild manner. This is a major public health problem. And I see this as giving staff direction. It may well be that they won't be able to totally pull this off the way all of us want it done, but at least it'll be another proposal for the public to look at.
Commissioner
and comment on.
Oh, Commissioner Bozovich and then Commissioner Berney.
Sorry, hang on just a second. I'll be right there. I just wanted to say that I'm a little disappointed in the motion that it doesn't include specific recommendations as to how to make this more protective. You're basically asking staff to come back with a rock. If I were staff, I would be greatly concerned about this motion because it's not telling them, I want you to change this, this, and this in the language and specifically prohibit this and change the elevation requirement here or remove this exemption there. You're basically just saying, come back with a rock that's more restrictive. I don't like the rock you brought me. And sending staff on to go find a rock task is not a good thing to do and is unfair to staff.
Commissioner Berney.
Well, I apologize. I agree with that. I don't think we want a rock wherever Commissioner Bozovich went. But Commissioner Sorensen, what I am interested in is looking at the principles of a prohibition in the floodway, not the entire floodplain. That there would be the kinds of exemptions that Mr. Miller indicated he could build in. especially as it relates to utilities, that were there building, there would be no change in the footprint of the existing structures. That we would look at what it would look like so that we eliminated the practice of river hardening. And I think Commissioner Bozovich, not that you agree with those things, but is that the kind of specificity you think needs to be provided here?
Yes, I think.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that staff would like to have that I'm not going to get that word out right now.
Specificity.
It's been a long week. Yeah, that. So yeah, I think that, and you may want to ask here, but I think that would be much preferred for them to have some clear direction. It also gives the public clear direction as to what we're going to have a continued public hearing on next time, so they're prepared to comment. If it's just something very generalized, how does somebody protect their property rights without knowing specifically what you're proposing?
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. And Commissioner Berney, you narrowed it down to the floodway and eliminated Commissioner Sorensen's language, which said floodplain. So that's a different motion then.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm realizing that.
I support what you mentioned, Commissioner.
Yeah, do you want, let me ask it this way. Do you want this motion modified to have the staff coming back with regard to the floodway only with the comments that Mr. Miller made and not make any changes in the floodplain components of this ordinance? Is that what is that the improvement you'd like to see made in this motion?
Commissioner Berney.
I believe so.
Yeah. Well, why don't we do that then? Why don't we modify this motion to make that clear that what we're talking about is banning much of the new floodway development with the exceptions that Mr. Miller wants to propose and put in. We won't make any other changes in it, and we'll come back with a public hearing. And then if there's some things that the public commenters want to suggest to be changed in the ordinance as it stands at that point, then we can look at whether we want to modify it further. So as long as that's the case, then I'm okay with that. And Chair, I'll be happy to conform my motion to just the floodway and not to the floodplain.
Chair Bob?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Andy Clark. I just wanted to weigh in real quick. The motion as it stands doesn't include approving the second and moving the third reading or continuing the public hearing as I heard it. And that will need to happen unless the idea is to let ordinance 2008 die and come back with another ordinance and a new notice and redo and all that stuff. And so the motion will need to specify that in addition to the changes you want to see.
Thank you for the clarification. In addition, I believe Commissioner Berney added some other items that he was interested in talking about as well.
Yeah, that's fine with me, and I agree with Mr. Clark that we should include that as part of the motion, and so please consider it part of the motion on both the leaving the hearing record open, setting the additional public hearing on the revised ordinance 20-08. And with that, I'll just go leave this for more discussion. And if there's needed changes in this motion, I'll be happy to try to make those.
Commissioner Berney, since you were the second on that motion originally.
It's still vague. I think we need someone to articulate what a or the motion is. But Commissioner Farr, I don't know if I could read your mind. Maybe you were going to do that.
I was just going to ask Joe for maybe Kier to read back what he hears the motion as it is as it's been stated. What do you hear, Kier?
I can try to give this a shot. What I hear and what I believe is the intent is to move the second reading and public hearing, move third reading public hearing for October 6th and direct staff to return with revised code language that prohibits the majority of development within the floodway with the exceptions for necessary public critical infrastructure. This could include living bank and channel hardening within the floodway as well.
Is that an exceptional reading of what we were talking about? Thank you.
Thank you, Kier.
Commissioner Sorensen and Commissioner Burney, you were the makers of the motion. Does that sound like what you propose?
Yes.
Here's how I will answer it. Thank you, Kier.
Okay, so Kier restated it. Commissioner Sorensen moved it. Commissioner Burney, you still second? Yes. Okay. Any discussion on that final motion? Okay. I don't see any further discussion, so we'll go to a vote. We lost a commissioner here. There we go. Okay, let's move to a vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed, say nay.
Nay.
All right, motion passes 4-1 with Commissioner Bozievich in the nay.
Chair Buck, can I hear the motion one more time from Kier? The one that is going to go into the record as the motion.
Kier?
Sure, let me try that again. Move the third reading and setting the public hearing on ordinance number 20-08 for October 6th, as well as order 20-08-18-13 for October 6th to prohibit the majority of development within the floodway, with the exceptions to enable certain critical facilities that serve a distinct public need, and to evaluate the removal of language enabling bank hardening within the floodway. I think that captures the gist of it, but certainly not as brief as the first one. Apologies.
Okay, I think staff got that. Diana's there in the background making notes. So very good. We will move on to item 11B, which is the first reading and setting the second reading and public hearing for ordinance number PA 1380 in the matter of the Eugene Springfield Metropolitan Area General Plan to adopt amendments to the Eugene Airport Master Plan and adopting the savings and severability clauses, file number 509-PA19-05770. And with us is Lindsay Eichner again, and she can introduce any guests.
Good afternoon, Chair Buck and Commissioners. I believe it's just me this afternoon. Dan Halverson is the senior planner at the City of Eugene, who's the project manager for this project, and he'll be available for the public hearing. But today I request approval of the first reading and setting of the second reading, as Chair Buck just stated. This will be a joint public hearing, and we will not be asking for a decision to be made at that public hearing, but we feel it's important to have the presentation to both you and the City Council at one meeting and hear all the public testimony at one meeting, and then you will each make your own decisions. The city will make their decision, and then it will come to you. So just to lay out the future steps of this project. If you have any questions, I'm available.
Any questions? Okay, and what was the date of that again?
Oh, my apologies. September 16th at 6 p.m. The City of Eugene will be hosting this meeting, and it will be on the Zoom platform. So I will make sure that information gets added to that, to a posted agenda for that week.
Commissioner Berney.
I move approval for the first reading and setting the second meeting and joint public hearing on ordinance number PA 1380 for September 16, 2020 at 6 p.m.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, moved by Commissioner Berney, second by Commissioner Sorensen. Any discussion? I don't see any, so we'll move to the vote. We're missing a commissioner again. Okay, for just a moment. There we go. Okay, we'll move to the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
I think Commissioner Rosevich said aye. All right, motion passes 5-0. Thank you. So we'll move back to item 8A, which is our administrative announcements.
I know it's getting late, Chair, so I'll try to be brief. I just wanted to share, there was a question I think Commissioner Bozovich asked last week about our coordination with the City of Eugene and City of Springfield around shelter and housing efforts, particularly as we prepare for the fall and the winter. And so I thought I'd give you a little update on that. The super siting application for 100 River Avenue is well underway. The deadline for submission to the City of Eugene is September 28th. It's been reviewed by land use planners and is going through our building code officials to be reviewed. We expect that formal submission will be made in the next few weeks, well in advance of the September 28th deadline. HomeShare Oregon, some of you may be aware, is now operating in Lane County. HomeShare Oregon is a software service that matches homeowners who have extra bedrooms or space to rent to low-income renters. Can serve as a homelessness prevention measure, and possibly could be suitable for for homeless folks who need an affordable place to live and a few other barriers to housing. It's been a significant success in Multnomah County. A note for the board to consider: there was a tax incentive, I believe, an exemption that's allowed in Multnomah County for homeowners who rent to people with very low incomes and charge no more than 30% of gross income for rent. So I just wanted to point that out to the board. It's an exciting and positive development for that service here in our community. We continue our property search for non-congregate shelter. So as the board knows, we've shared with you that we're looking actively at identifying properties in Lane County and Eugene and in Springfield in particular, and working in coordination between the three entities. Both cities have distinct criteria for what they can consider. In addition to potential motels and apartment complexes, here's what we're looking for. And I'll just share this with you. So if you have contacts or know of a property available, flat, dry land that is accessible by roads, preferably within a half mile from a transit location. It can be anywhere in the county, including unincorporated county land. We're also relying on our realtor that we're working with, their knowledge of public lands already in control by a public agency, and from there expanding the search to provide, to look at private properties with owners that may be willing to work with the county and municipalities to support sheltering. Several nonprofit housing developers have offered up land for this use from 12 to 60 months, depending on the need. And these properties will be the staging area for what we're calling safe sleeping villages, where we'll set up villages of up to 40 people where ordinances, local ordinances would allow for 12 to 18 months at least. One example that I'll share with you that I mentioned earlier was the partnership between Carry It Forward and Shelter Care. I believe there's Shelter Care property at the edge of Eugene that they're using to shelter and navigate up to 12 individuals. We're also considering empty box stores, warehouses, and other large indoor spaces that may be for rent or potential purchase for 6 to 18 months for indoor congregate shelter. But again, we know that there are challenges with congregate shelter. We can't fit as many people in a large space as we typically could because of the pandemic. Lane County Public Health and Human Services, our Human Services Division, are working to identify potential motels and hotels that would be willing to rent their facility, potentially their entire facility or a large portion of their facility for 6 to 8 months. And Human Services has a proposal from Camp Harlow for housing 6 to 12 families from October to March. The critical work of inclement weather strategies around sheltering services and warming are underway with our TAC implementation team. And we expect, I mentioned this to the board, I think last week or a couple weeks ago, that we're standing up a cross-jurisdictional, what's called an ESF 6, Emergency Support Function 6 for mass care vulnerable populations. So this is part of the incident command structure lingo. And ESF 6 is a section of an incident command system that's focused on mass care for vulnerable populations. So when you hear us talk about ESF 6, that's what it's referring to. And this would be a cross-jurisdictional, essentially emergency operation focused on mass care for vulnerable populations between Lane County, City of Eugene, City of Springfield, as well as nonprofit partners that would all participate in that. It's a really positive development. So we will continue all of our emergency operations work on COVID response for the community generally, but we're standing up this sort of joint effort around the unhoused population with these various entities. And I, for one, am excited about that work because it's leveraging all of our collective knowledge, experience, and resources to solve the short-term challenge and leverage opportunities that we identify in the short term for long-term solutions. So the City of Eugene specifically, there's a question about the City of Eugene. The City of Eugene has a number of microsites and potential winter options that are under consideration. We're early in the process, so those have not been specifically, all of those have not been identified yet, but as we move closer into the fall and winter, we'll share more about that. So I'll stop there because I know it's late, but I did want to provide you with that of the really strong collaborative work that's happening. I had a great conversation with the Springfield City Manager, new Springfield City Manager, Nancy Newton, yesterday. She comes from working in counties at Clackamas County and Sacramento County in California. And so she's got a great perspective from a county working in counties. And she was sharing what they did in Sacramento County, a similar model as this Home Share Oregon, where they actually identified renters, vacant rental properties, and then the government would lease those spaces and place unhoused individuals into them. So I just share all those as examples of the collaborative work that's happening and a big lift that needs to occur because we know we have approximately 1,200 unsheltered individuals in the community that we need to identify locations for. And we can't just identify a handful of locations to put a couple hundred people each. It's, multiple locations that we're putting 10, 15, 20, 30, maybe up to 40 individuals at the most. That's it for now, unless you have other questions for me, Chair.
Commissioner Farr and then Commissioner Burney.
Thank you, Chair Buck. Just a couple real quickly. Thank you for the collaborative pep talk, Mr. Mokrzycki. I think I'm waiting for the collaboration to materialize, really. We have our Shelter Stakeholder Committee meeting on Thursday. We'll be talking a little bit more about the ESF 6 and what exactly that means. But my question is this. The city of Eugene says they have microsites that they've identified. Why aren't they telling us what those microsites are? Do you have a reason for that?
My understanding is that the work, sorry, Commissioner.
Yeah, what the locations are. You know,
Yeah.
they say they specifically have some sites on the table, but we don't know what they are.
And you know, it's my understanding that the city of Eugene is going through their process for reviewing those properties and identifying those. And so it's not only our hope, but our expectation that we all will come to the table, because we all have to be partnered. I mean, that's what a partner is, you know, everyone comes to the table with solutions.
Sure.
I appreciate I don't have those in front of me now, but you know, when we receive them, we'll certainly share them with the board. And I appreciate your comment about the pep talk. I don't mean to be overly optimistic. I guess I'm trying to be optimistic. I don't mean to be blind in terms of the challenge that's ahead of us. It is a big challenge. It was a challenge before COVID, and it's multiplied many times more because of COVID, because of the challenge it creates with so many sites. So the demand is greater than the supply, and we need everyone, public, private, nonprofit, and individual residences, to step up and assist with the challenge. And it's going to be a big lift from now until late fall.
In fact, Mr. Mokoraisen, we do have an individual that we identified years ago, but we finally have that person in place, and that is Sarai Johnson, who reports to you and the city manager. So Sarai reports to you and Sarah Maderi, who is the Eugene city manager at this point in time. So we're hoping for and expecting a great deal from that office. You know, we put a great deal of trust in it. We've waited a long time for that office to begin its work. Sarai is chief staff for the Shelter Stakeholder Committee, but I am concerned that the city of Eugene does not seem to be bought into supporting that office the way the county has. You don't need to comment on that right now. That is a concern that I have.
Commissioner Burney.
+1 to Commissioner Farr's remarks. And yes, Steve, how dare you be optimistic? Although I must say, that's the only way big challenges are met. So please, no false humility, stay optimistic. Now, this is normally a conversation I would have on the side, but I have to ask you because you invited it. Are you saying there's an opportunity to put a private group together with the express purpose of purchasing, if available, some hotels that are either marginal or having some tough economic times now, and the ownership would like to get out of them, and then having that group lease back to the city and county to provide the rooms as necessary, which would give them the cash flow to then move further on those investments? Am I hearing you correctly?
That's not, I mean, I don't think that's a terrible idea.
Is that opportunity there?
It could be an opportunity. It's not what I was necessarily suggesting, but I'm not saying that it's not an opportunity that could be to leverage the private sector's ability to do that. I think we have been very explicit for many months that there is, you know, we talked about the state money, the federal money that the state has been sitting on, that we need, you know, if we could acquire a motel, that would be ideal, because it would allow us to meet the short-term need, because those are individual, they're single room occupancy. So they're really great for unhoused individuals, for quarantine and isolation, for those that don't have to go into the hospital, as well as just for sheltering during the winter months. And then after COVID, this is what Salt Lake City did, is before they had the Olympics, they bought up a lot of the older motels because new properties were being built for the Olympics. The governments bought up the older properties, and then they converted them into permanent supportive housing. It was one of their handful of strategies that effectively ended homelessness in that community. So that's more so what I was referring to, but I think we'll consider any option to help solve it.
But public or private, it sounds like that's the path. And so I'm 100% supportive of that. Is that something that some of the federal money that Lane County is eligible for would be a legitimate expenditure?
We believe so. Yes.
Well, then there's
we believe it should be.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I see this as opportunity. Thank you very much.
I agree with you 100%, Commissioner.
Any other comments or questions? Commissioner Bozovich had to go to another urgent issue. So it's just us for the end here. If there's nothing else for the announcements, we'll move on to commissioners' announcements. Any commissioner announcements? Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. And as I mentioned earlier in the meeting, I wanted to talk about the Equity and Access Advisory Board meeting tomorrow. I'll be making sure that they understand that you have scheduled for October 20th, Chair Buck, the presentation by the sheriff. I've not heard that that's the date that's been agreed by the sheriff, but that's the date that's on our book right now. I'll be presenting that to them tomorrow night. So I'll be sitting in, I typically sit as a fly on the wall of that meeting. I'm not a participant in the meeting. Then I will also mention that we do have listening sessions both tonight and Wednesday night. Tonight is juvenile justice, juvenile justice, and then Wednesday night is on economic.
Very good. It did sound like that date was confirmed for the sheriff for our board as we speak now. Commissioner Sorensen.
I just want to announce that my term of office ends in 125 days and that I have had a number of very productive emails and telephone calls with staff regarding the onboarding process for my successor. And just wanted to thank everybody for helping out with the planning for the onboarding. Thank you.
125. Here we go. If he can tear a page. Any other announcements, Commissioner Burney?
I just wanted to say to Pete, given his announcement, you may recall a song that starts with 4 and 20 years ago. And I want you to know that I'm working on lyrics to try and make my first singing appearance in January at your last day. I apologize. Thank you very much, Chair.
I look forward to that. All right, any future board assignment requests? Now remember, we just took one off our list. Okay. No future board assignments. Review of assignments, Mr. Mokryski.
Chair Buck.
Yes.
I think Diana wants to say something.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. On one more item on the assignments list that we did not talk about during the item was there was an open assignment for a letter to be drafted to the governor that you were going to sign, and I was informed by Austin Ramirez that rather than drafting a letter, you actually spoke directly in a meeting with them to the topic. So I'm going to close that assignment as well if the board approves.
That makes sense, Mr. Mokryski. I think you brought that one up. But
yes, that was an assignment by Steve.
If there's head nods to remove, you got one for me. Looks like we got head nods to remove that one as well from at least 3.
Thank you.
Okay, now review of assignments.
So I don't have anything new. And if I'm right, I will say congratulations because you successfully removed 2 from the list and didn't add any today. So that's great. And we're going to hire Keir Miller as the interpreter of all complex motions in the future.
Very good. Okay. Any emergency business for the afternoon? None. And we know we have no executive session for this afternoon. Any other business for the day? Okay, don't see any. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.